Okay, good morning. Welcome to Brave Indigenous Conversations with Joan Jack. And those of you who are regular listeners know that I've found this beautiful piece of writing that I start the podcast with: an invitation to a brave space. Together we will create brave space because there is no such thing as a safe space. We exist in the real world. We all carry scars, and we have all caused wounds. In this space, we seek to turn down the volume of the outside world. We amplify voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. We call each other to more truth and love. We have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. And we have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. We will not be perfect. It will not always be what we wish it to be, but it will be our brave space together, and we will work on it side by side. That was written by Mickey Scott B. Jones, who's gone to the spirit world, Black woman. All right. This morning I have Roxanne Shuttleworth with me, who I met through the Deadly Cookums and Aunties a couple of years ago now. And we've become friends. And I invited her to join me, and I'd like to invite her to introduce herself to all of you. Good morning,
Thank
Roxanne.
you, Joan. Good morning. Who am I? I am, how do I identify? Politically, I identify as a non status Métis. And I know that annoys the heck out of my previous friends in the world I was in before. I worked for about 20 years at the University of Manitoba. I started in student advising at what was the Native Students Office, which has now become a building. Good for them. And then I moved over to the Asper School of Business as the coordinator there, one of their Aboriginal programs. And prior to that, I was attended college in Medicine Hat. I lived there briefly, or a few years when I was married. Then I came home and I attended college here, and I'm actually a library technician by trade. Yeah, and so I was in that world, and I worked in the school back home as a librarian, and then I decided to go back and get a university degree at the U of M, and that's where I was until I left that world, and that's why I say. I am non-status, but I am also Métis.
Yes.
And one of the things I told the professor who really used to just, and I would say it just to get on him, eh? And but I told him, I said, I am non-status. My great grandfather was one of the signatories of Treaty 2, but
Mm,
at the same time, in my grandparents' house, his daughter, and my grandmother and grandfather's house, we learned to jig. We learned to square dance, and but at the same time, that same grandmother took me to my first powwow when I was 8.
mm,
So I am that is how I identify. And so I grew up in a business family. My parents, until they settled down, once I started school, I'm the oldest in my family. My parents operated one of the first taxis in Manitoba, and started the Aboriginal Livery Association in Manitoba. I don't know if it still exists, but they were part of the founding members of that. And they were also the founding members of the MMF. My mother was the very first secretary in that organization. And and then my dad purchased the taxi, and then he purchased a gravel truck, which he kept until just a few years ago. He's 86, and he's actually still driving today. He's driving for business out of Dauphin here. He let his truck go with all the maintenance work, and he continues to drive to this day.
mm,
And so I grew up in business. Um, I learned at a young age what it takes to run a business, how to treat your customers, all of that. When they sold the taxi, my mom actually said to him, "Come home and run your taxi or sell it," because
mm,
she was working full time. And so when they sold the taxi, it was 9 cars. And
mm.
me and my brother kept those cars clean every week, and that was our allowance, or how we earned our money. So from the time I was 9, 10, 11 years old, I was part of the family business. And that's just how it is when you have a family business. You do everything. But I went into that post-secondary world. I was in the secondary world, and then I went into the post-secondary world, and I loved what I did. But I do admit, and I have to be honest, leaving the University of Manitoba was one of the most toxic workplaces I've ever worked in. Brave Indigenous conversations, I'll be honest. And it took me about 3 years to recover from that, to heal from that. And I was working in the Aboriginal world there. And it was still we can be so mean to each other. It's really sad. My goal, I traveled for a few years with my job, and I did a lot of contract work with my brother. We are trainers, facilitators. We write curriculum. We customize the curriculum we write for people. I traveled with a band for a while, and I'm the niece of a very famous Aboriginal band in that world. So I traveled with them for a while. And then I got tired of traveling. I'd been traveling at the U of M, and then I was traveling with the band, and I was just tired. And I was like, I want to stay home. And I've been, and I decided to go full time with my sewing, one of my passions. So when I decided to come home in 2019, I opened a store here in Dauphin. That was one of my bucket lists. I'm in Dauphin right now, Dauphin, Manitoba. And so I opened Parkland Fabrics in 2019. COVID hit. And, we learned a lot of things from COVID, but it just was something I never did get a chance to recover from. People were great. I had a lot of support here from school divisions, organizations, like the MMF, the Friendship Center, was really good. But at the same time, I just never, either that or there just was no demand for a fabric store in Dauphin, which was interesting because I know when I was a young girl, and I've been sewing for about 50 years, and I'm not lying, I'm 62 today or right now. And my grandmothers, both of them, and my aunties and my mother were all sewers. So I had to prove myself to use a sewing machine. I had to learn how to cross stitch, embroidery, crocheting, knitting. I do all those things. And then before I could use a sewing machine. So then when I did that, I made my first outfit when I was 11.
Wow.
Yeah, I was 11. And I actually found the pattern, if it's posted somewhere on my page. And my design page is Wolf Quay. It's at the bottom there by my name. And so I went public. I say public in 2009. That's when I posted my design page. But I've actually been sewing, honestly, for 50 years. So that's, and it's my passion. I love it. And plus beadwork. I just learned to do beading. Shout out to Ali Yaput in Thunder Bay. Taught me how to bead, or actually I think reminded me, because I found out later one of my grandmothers was known for her beadwork, and I never knew that. And I've been looking for some of her beadwork. I haven't found it. So if any of you come across beadwork done by Mary Spence, who became a Ranville, let me know, because I've kept an eye open and I'm always watching with old beadwork if there's anything that I can find that's that she did. So, and I actually have beadwork my other grandmother did, my Grandma Shuttleworth, the one whose dad signed Treaty 2.
Wow.
So I've been, so I love beading. I do it often. I usually end my day with beading, and my beadwork's also on my design page. So that's just a bit about who I am.
You're so amazing. I write. I've learned to write down interesting things that trigger my mind when people are sharing. And I wrote down like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 things.
Wow.
Before I go back to any of them, I wanted you to talk a little bit about your design work with the mukluk place, because
Manitoba Mucklucks.
yeah, you were with them for a while too, right?
I was, and apparently I found out they've sold. Sean
Oh,
has sold them, and I knew Sean. I met him through my work at the U of M, and of course, being a business owner, entrepreneur, he was one of the people we highlighted. So I met him briefly that way, and their Storyboot project is where I was involved. I don't know if that's still what it is because I'm no longer with them.
okay.
Um,
Do you know
anyway, I
anything,
found
Roxanne, do you know anything about the history of the company? Because everybody's wearing Manitoba Mucklucks now all over the world. Do you know?
yes.
I don't know anything about the company and how it started. Did you learn anything about that?
He started in Winnipeg. He had mentors
Mm,
and some really good mentors, obviously. And he focused and learned well, and he focused on developing a global brand.
right.
And he was, as I said, mentored very well. People helped him, or he paid for that help,
Mm,
and but did very well. I mean, I wished him the best then. I still do.
yes.
And one of his initial goals that
Is
he
he?
talked about,
Who is he? Is he Indigenous? Is
oh
he
yeah, he's a Métis
a
guy
Métis
from
guy
Winnipeg. Yeah,
from Winnipeg? Okay, cool.
yes, yes. And yeah, so where I worked at the University of Manitoba, the Aboriginal Business Education Program, we hosted a dinner once a year, Excellence in Aboriginal Leadership. It's a dinner and award thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, and he was one of the recipients one year. So we got to know him a bit more. And so, yes, he's a Métis man from Winnipeg.
Okay.
And his initial goal, he talked about it at the dinner where he was received the award, was the Storyboot project. And
Mm,
what that was, they were the only company, the only business that had a place where people like me and others who did beadwork, mucklucks, moccasins, could sell their product to a global market and
wow.
keep 100% of the proceeds.
Wow.
And there's no business anywhere that does that.
That's brilliant.
And absolutely fabulous.
Oh,
Then he sold it. I heard wind he sold it. And sometime last year, I think it was. And then we got the Storyboot people got products or got a new contract for our products
mm,
from Manitoba Mucklucks. And I read the contract twice, as
mm,
always. And then I
mhm.
contacted them and said, please explain this.
Right.
And it wasn't explained.
Mm,
Um, and and then I was frustrated because I asked 2 or 3 times. I phoned, I
mhm.
emailed, and said, I don't understand this because now they're keeping a percentage
Wow.
from our sales.
Okay.
And I'm thinking, okay, Sean said himself that he never wanted to keep anything to allow the artisans to keep 100% of their 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 sales, and
Mhm.
that and they also initially when I first started, they said my prices were too low. And they encouraged me to put them up, which I did, and then my stuff sold. And I was like, wow. But that's the reality of a global market. When you're no
Right.
longer selling to just, Canadians or local people, you've got a whole
Yeah.
globe, wanting
Wow.
your product. So, so when this new contract came out, I couldn't get any information, and I made a post about it. And
Mhm.
one of the items on, yeah, one of the items on the contract was they were going to be monitoring my Facebook page. And of course, I said, yeah, wait a minute. So, needless to say, a few emails back and forth. And I did actually speak with someone who knew about the contract, and he explained why the changes. And I said, okay, I can live with that. And I made an addendum to my post. And I said, okay, I got the information. This is it, and blah, 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 blah. But by then they were like, no, we can't use you anymore, and
Oh,
we're not going to use your product, and you had a negative post and all of that. I'm like, okay, whatever.
wow.
So unfortunately, I'm no longer with them,
Oh,
and you know I'm okay with that. Like, Yeah, I wish I was.
Done that, been there, have the T-shirt, you know.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, and I don't know who owns them anymore.
Huh.
And like it's not Sean, but I think he stayed on as an advisor or something. And so yeah, that
Cool.
was my
Cool though.
experience with them.
Very cool that you even did that.
Yeah,
So do you mind if I circle back with you and just pick up some of the things you mentioned?
sure.
Okay. All right. So when you said you were non-status, maybe I'll just share for a bit. You were non-status Métis. Like for our listeners who aren't familiar with, you know, I was going to say our non-Indigenous listeners, but even Indigenous, many of our people don't understand or don't.
Exactly.
Why would
Right.
they know? Why would they know? You know, things
Yes.
the way they are. And so how we identify is, I remember, if we're going to be really brave here, when I was in law school, I did, you get to do, well, you have to do 3 credits of directed research in order to graduate. I actually did, I think, I don't know, 6 or 9. Like I was a prolific writer and researcher. And one of my pieces was um, basically making argument that it's Métis blasphemy. Okay, so all my Métis family and friends, please don't get me hate mail here. But my mom was livid. But like I wrote a paper saying a 90-page paper saying that, you know, the advent of the Métis, aside from, you know, Louis Riel and all of the Métis founders, um, for the Red River Métis, which is another issue.
Oh yeah.
Excuse me, hang on. I got a little tickle this morning. Are basically came to be in response to the Canadian state and legal initiatives of the Canadian state to not acknowledge them and rub them out and whatever. So, um, and so when I did this big long paper, it's interesting about the connections because my grandparents, George and Marie Louise McKay, were also founding board members of the Manitoba Métis Federation. And so
Wow.
I didn't know we had that connection. And
Yeah.
so we grew up on the Métis side of the river in Barons River, Manitoba, because in Ojibwe, in Anishinaabe, they say Osaga Motogo. And that means those are the ones that left. So that's what people on the ground chose to choose our Métis ancestors as if we left. But really, it was the Canadian state that pushed these
Hmm.
people out and decided that they did not qualify to be registered as Indian. And
Right.
so there's a whole big thing about that out there. But then, and this is also going to sound really racist. Sorry, it's just, you know, what I think. And then I grew up in a Métis culture primarily till I left Barons River really, and then realized, holy smokes, like I'm like defined, like I had this whole big journey trying to figure out what the hell am I? Where do I lie?
Hmm.
You know?
Yep.
And I did ultimately acquiesce, I guess, I don't know, and get registered as an Indian in Canada because I qualified. You know, after Bill C-31, I qualified. There were some racist corrections made to the Canadian law, the racist Canadian law, which is still racist, that allowed me to qualify to be registered, but I didn't register. Like in 85, I
Hmm.
didn't register. I was like, as if the Canadian state's going to tell me who the hell I am, you know?
Right. Yeah. 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 I know exactly. Yes.
Finally, when I got pregnant with, so then I married Brian Jack, who is a registered Indian. And then when I realized, and I was pregnant with his child, and then because I'm a lawyer, I thought, oh my God, like if I don't register, you know, then my child is potential is going to be like a 6'2", and so my grandchildren are going to have no um right to register. And I talked about it with Brian, and he was like, well, it's up to you, you know. So I registered and I qualified as a a 6'2". So you can look it up, people who don't know all these 6'1", 6'2".
Yeah.
But so a 6'1" and a 6'2" that have a child produce a 6'1". So I wanted my child to have full descent rights, and that whole thing is a thing. But the other thing that struck me about your share this morning is how Métis people are really business people. And this is also, you know, the moose in the room, the sacred moose in the room, for me to even say this out loud, but I'm going to be brave. I'm going to say it out loud. I think the good thing about being cut out of what is basically turned into a crappy deal was not the intention of the people who signed the treaty to end up impoverished in their own homeland. No, but
No.
that is what has happened. And the dependency on the Canadian state, forever fighting the Canadian state to fulfill its treaty obligations, which it has not done. That
Mhm.
mentality and that dependency didn't happen with the Métis, because there was nothing. If you didn't grow a garden, if you didn't fish and hunt,
Mhm.
if you didn't run some kind of business, you did not eat. And
Yep.
so most Métis people are really, really strong in business.
Yep.
And I think that's turned out to be a benefit. I see you biting at the bit. Go, Roxanne.
No, I agree. I totally agree. And as you're speaking, I'm remembering my grandmother's words. And my grandmother Shuttleworth, who's my dad, her dad signed Treaty 2. The thing that about that though, Jim Flett, and I think he signed under his traditional Indian name or Aboriginal name. Anyway, he signed, and the thing is, he actually had the first trading post in our community in that part of Manitoba. The first settlement or town in Manitoba was Manitoba House, which is 5 miles down the road from where I grew up. Probably more like 10, but it's right there. And there was a Hudson Bay post. The thing is, when he signed treaty, he now had to send all of his income into Ottawa, where Indian Affairs would decide what he and his family would live on and send it back. Well, after 3 years of this, he said, the hell with that. And he took land scrip, or signed out,
Signed.
because he wanted to keep his income.
For our listeners who don't understand need some background for what Roxanne's sharing, until about 1951, if a registered Indian could not own land, go to university, hire a lawyer, consume alcohol. I may be missing a couple of things.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so a registered Indian could not legally do any of those things and maintain their legal status as a registered Indian.
That's right.
Thinking being that then they were behaving like a civilized white man.
Yes.
Because civilized white people own land, go to university, become a pastor. You couldn't become a pastor like in a church and stuff like that. We couldn't become a priest. So once the racist thinking underlying the Indian Act was that once a registered Indian started to exhibit some of those, white civilized characteristics, then they no longer needed to be dependent on the state.
Exactly.
As an Indian.
Yeah.
Join the army was another one.
Yes, veterans. Yeah.
People, because this is our land. When the war happened, World War I, World War II, when those wars happened, they were like, shit, I'm going to go fight for my land. This is my land.
Yes, exactly.
They ended up automatically enfranchised.
Yes.
So what your ancestor deliberately chose, though, thought, forget this. I signed that treaty, but I'm out of here. This is not what I wanted. This is not what I
Yes. This is not what we signed. And that's the thing. Like, that was not, they talk about intent. Our ancestors knew exactly what they were doing. It's the Canadian government and the Crown who did not honor those treaties. Absolutely. To this day, they haven't honored those treaties. So that was his choice. And my grandmother, I remember her talking about things, and as a child where I grew up, it was you were seen and not heard. But, it was great because I learned so much by just sitting in the corner and not talking. Because if I started to make noise, I was chased outside, go play, one. So, and being who I was, I preferred to sit inside and listen to the adults, right?
Yeah.
But I remember her saying, for example, the very worst thing that happened to our people, and she didn't see Métis and status and nonsense. She just saw the people. And I remember in 1986, when all this changed, she said, I was born an Indian. I was raised an Indian. I've lived my whole life an Indian, and I'll die an Indian. Yet she had no status,
Yeah.
because there's those people in our communities and those old ones, that number means nothing. That
Mm.
Canadian government number, I'm an Indian. And that's how she lived her life.
Yeah. My
And
grandpa, I have to interject and share that,
yeah,
like you have, how do you say, like pivotal moments in your life, or there's a fancy word for it when you have life-changing moments. And for me, one of them was my grandpa Mackay. He, I remember so clearly one day saying to me, "Don't ever forget you're an Indian." And yet
yeah,
he was in the MMF, he was
definitely.
champion for Métis rights and all this
Yeah,
stuff, but he still used the word, "Don't ever forget you're an Indian." He said to
yes.
me.
Yeah. And like going back, I'll go back to what my grandmother was saying in a bit. But in saying that, um, I said I graduated from Medicine Hat College. Actually, I didn't even go to that grad. I forget. I might have been visiting in Manitoba, whatever. And then I finished the Red River College library program. And that was through New Careers and Frontier School, and that's a whole other story for another time. But we all went. My parents went to that graduation, and we all went and had a darn good time, and it was a wonderful experience. And I met librarians from across Manitoba. I think there was 27 of us who started that program, and we went through it, and then we finished and graduated. And we were all school librarians for Frontier School Division.
Ah,
So then when I decided, and that was in 86, I
mm,
believe. No, 88, 88.
mm,
So, and then in 1990, I decided to go to Winnipeg and do a degree.
mhm.
And my dad was not impressed. Why are you going there? You got work. You got good work. And I think part of it was he just didn't want his daughter and his grandbabies leaving.
Yeah, yeah.
And but the other part of it, and he never let me forget, and my mother was the same way. He said, "Don't you ever forget who you are and where you come from." And he said that to me on a regular basis every time I came home from Winnipeg for a visit. And he always said that to me, like, don't forget who you are and where you come from. And my mother would always say, you learn their game.
Mm,
You learn their game very well, and then you beat them. You
mm,
beat them at their own game. And that's how they advised me to
yeah,
live in this non-Aboriginal world, right?
mhm,
And I remember having to tell my students that, like, my students at the Asper School of Business were doing a commerce degree, which was a 5-year degree, very tough to get in, very tough to finish. And and they would tell me some of their frustrations, and I said, you know what, I'm sorry, but yes, in this world we have to be twice as good to be considered half as good.
hey, I want to talk about that a bit because that's actually an important thing. I remember in law school, as another one of my directed research projects, um, I wrote about Anishinaabe law, a big,
Hmm.
another
Yeah.
100-page thing. And then I took my first draft into Professor Guth. He was a German man. And I took it into him for he was my supervising person or whatever. And so I took it into him and for a first draft to have him look at it. And then I went to pick it up, and he had taken his red pen and struck out entire pages of my document. And I, of course, hit the roof, and I was like, what the hell,
Hmm.
And he said, listen here, young lady, you signed up to learn about the white law. I don't know what this stuff is. We don't care about what this stuff is. This stuff has no place here. You signed up to learn about the white law. And if you can't do that, you will fail. And so I, of course, was deeply offended and screaming and crying and whatever. And then I thought about it. And as time has passed, like he really did me a favor. Like he
Yes.
really did me a favor, you know.
Yep.
And he did also say, when you're done, when you have the degree on the wall, he said, then you go and talk about your own people's law, but not
Hmm.
right now. He said, nobody wants to hear about this in law school. and you're not going to get any marks for this. I mean, that was 30 years ago. Things probably have changed maybe a bit on a good day, I'll
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
But no,
They
yeah,
may
no,
be more polite or more gentle in how they say
yeah,
that, but no, he's right. And that's what my parents talked about. Learn their game
yeah,
and learn it well
yeah,
and then beat them at it.
yeah. Like I think there's
That's
other larger forces that are at play and should be at play dealing with systemic and institutional racism and all that thing. But when you go in as a student, you're there to parrot, to learn the curriculum and repair to parrot
yep.
it.
And
That's
that's it.
very few
Yeah.
original thoughts are required. Do not
Yes.
even have any actually.
Never. Never. Because and I learned that like and I taught my students that like I taught at the university level and but I didn't have a grad degree. I have an undergrad. So, but I did tell my students and I did actually develop and write and teach three courses that are still on the books there that I really resentful of, but I've let it go. I started walking the old way, I call it, in 1990 when I moved to Winnipeg. I learned about who we are. I had never ever heard about ceremony. I had never heard about any of those things, and I understand now why, but I had to go over there to learn it. So I've been walking the with the ancestors, I say, for over 30 years, a sun
Mm,
dancer, all those things. I carry a lodge, I'm a pipe carrier, all of that. And I understand why I wasn't taught that or why I didn't learn that at home. But
mm,
when I was teaching these classes and I'd have people handing in papers, I told students, you know what? I'm giving you this paper back. It is so good. Save it for your grad work. Because
mm,
right now, I said, if you turn this paper in, I said, this university will own it. And I
mm,
said, when you get your grad degree or work on your grad degree, then you own your own
mm.
writing.
Nice.
So, so I would give students that their papers back.
Mm,
Actually did that 4 times. And I
mm,
said, keep this. This is brilliant. This is
yeah,
wonderful work. And so I always tell people that save your best work for when it's going to be
yeah,
yours.
yeah,
And
yeah.
but that's one of the things I learned there in that institution, and then figuring out how to survive there. And so yeah, and when I was saying about my grandmother, I remember her sitting with her sisters and the old ladies, and all of them are gone now. But she said that. I remember her saying, and I want to come back to this. She said, one of the worst things that ever happened to our people was social assistance.
Yeah.
And I didn't understand it at the time,
Mm,
but I did, of course, later when you
mm,
talked about the Métis and they had to survive. We had to survive. And I say we, it is part of who I am. The funny thing is, my brother and I were hired, did a contract to write a manual for the MMF. And maybe now I realize it's different, but they questioned everything we wrote. And we were saying, we grew up hearing this. This
mm,
happened in our living room. When I was 6 years old, I remember the meetings in
mm.
1967, in my parents' living room by the original founders of the MMF. And people were like, they had no response, but they didn't like the history we were writing. And I don't know if they ever used that manual. We were paid, so I didn't care at that point. But yeah, it was, interesting. And at the time frustrating because I was thinking, we know what we're talking about. Like, you know,
Mhm.
and my mother being the first secretary, we ended up donating all those documents to the U of M, and
Wow.
they've got it in their archives there somewhere.
Mm,
Even though those same professors that we were in touch with, really disliked when I would say I'm a non-status Métis.
mhm.
you know, and that was a thing with that we were running into over at the MMF because and I ended up telling one of them very bluntly, if you would remember who your grandmothers are, you
Mm,
wouldn't have an issue with this because your
yeah.
grandmother was status.
Mm,
Guaranteed someone back there was status. That's how you became, we
yeah.
identified as a Métis. So
Yeah. Yeah. We have a bit of time left, so another sort of random, like way out off of this topic. I'm really interested to know what you would share about your journey in fabric design.
Oh,
Because
yes.
you're actually a fabric designer.
Yes,
And
I
so
am.
you didn't
And I'm
say that
very, very proud of that.
yeah.
Well, about, well,
Start at the beginning of your fabric design journey, like for maybe
in
there.
2015 is where it started.
Okay.
And I was sewing and I was doing custom work and I was doing ceremony sewing and I was doing ribbon wear, I call it, sewing at that time. And I was frustrated with the lack of anything Aboriginal,
Mhm.
anything First Nation. There was nothing out there. There was one designer, and I forget, Dorothy from BC.
Dorothy Grant. Dorothy Grant.
That's it. She was the only person who was making her own fabric and then apparel from it. And I thought, okay, that's a quite, and what I wanted to do. And I did some digging, and there's places you can go online. Spoonflower was one of them, where you can submit your artwork and they'll make fabric. And I thought, okay, this is very expensive, limiting, etc. So I Googled that, and the only thing I came up with was in Montreal. And I thought, okay, I love Montreal, but I'm not going to Montreal. So I waited a couple of days and I did it again. And this time a mill, what I did is I Googled in Winnipeg and a mill popped up, Siltex. So I called them, they invited me in for a meeting and I told them what I wanted to do. And of course, they said they'd never heard of such a thing. And I said, yeah, I know. And I said, you know what? It's coming. I said, it's coming where our people, Aboriginal, and they were very, very respectful. Our people are going to explode onto this world and we need to be ready. And I want to be ready. And so they asked me to submit my art. They said, we'll do one or two lines as a test. We'll try it out.
Yeah.
So I sent in, I think, 5 pieces of art, and they accepted all 5. And then the next thing I know, they're doing all of them. And the next thing I know after that is they're doing them all in several colors. So, and it took a year because cotton batiks is what we initially went with. Cotton batik is made by hand. It can only be made by hand. So people say to me, it's so expensive. And it's like, yes, but it takes 18 people 1 hour to make 1 meter. So yes, it's expensive. And this is in Indonesia. And I had told them as well, I don't want any children working on this. I'm not going to do it if that's part of it, and et cetera. So I had my own things that I wanted for them to follow. So it ended up they came out with 56 bolts or 56 patterns, and they sold out immediately.
Wow.
And they were telling me they went to a fabric store in I think it was Fort Francis, and the owner, non-Aboriginal fabric store, those are new as well, by the way. He said, follow me into the back when they showed them the samples. And Miles, my contact at Siltex, one of my contacts, he said he was worried. He thought, oh, I've offended somebody. And he followed him into the back. He sat down at his desk and he looked at Miles and he said, do you know how many years we've been waiting for this? He said, I want it all. He took it all, took everything. Then I had another lady stop in from Saskatchewan. Friends of mine were visiting. She came with them. They were stopping in briefly. I forget why. And I was showing them my samples. And she looked at me and she was almost crying and she choked up and she said, thank you. Never have we been represented like this. And so that was in 2016. And I've been releasing about a line a year, since then. And it's cotton batiks. 2 years ago, they started with cottons. I spoke with Karaoke-Ma, and Karaoke-Ma is one of the new designers.
Yeah,
her fabrics are.
She's my relative. Yeah, she's
wonderful.
Yeah.
So I've spoken with her twice, and I'm so glad she's got her line out. Shannon Gustafson is another one. So there's these new designers coming, and I think it's wonderful. I think it's just fabulous that we have more designers coming. Jackie Travers You know,
Yeah.
her line is out. Beautiful, beautiful. She's actually working with Siltex, is who's I'm working with.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I'm just think it's wonderful that all these new designers are coming out and available for
One of the
us.
thing I noticed, because I'm married into the Tlingit Nation here in Western Canada, and so one of the things I've noticed in the, because I sew as well, not as much as
Right.
you.
Yeah.
I love sewing, and looking for West Coast patterns and stuff. I think that there's a issue with cultural appropriation. Like
Oh, definitely.
I think,
Definitely.
is that happening? Like there's I've tried to check the source, like the on the side of the fabric, in the white part of the fabric, there's the name
Yeah.
of where it comes from or whatever. I've tried to check and make sure that you know proper respect and has been paid,
Yeah.
and so do you know anything about that in your space around, and
We, yeah, we looked at it, and we actually had a small designer retreat about, I don't know, 8 years ago, 7, 8 years ago. And actually, BC First Nations, or some of them, or many of them, are actually, they have some kind of trademark.
mm,
And we
mm,
found the designers that got together were all from Manitoba and Saskatchewan. But we found her, one of them knew that she was actually questioned. Actually, she was questioned by somebody in BC saying, are you from BC First Nation? And why are you using our patterns? But
mm,
actually, she married into the community, and
mm,
her husband was designing with her. So she
mm,
said, my husband is, and I'm not sure what nation they're from, but said that. So they do. We didn't, and we don't have that. We need that because our designs, like all of the Elizabeth Studio, and I'm going to name it Brave Conversation.
yeah,
I called them, and a friend of mine called them initially to see what they were doing with designers. They wouldn't talk to us.
mm,
They would not acknowledge or say they had an Aboriginal designer on in the house or on staff. It's like house designers.
mhm.
Um, their stuff is strictly stolen from
Wow.
us. And now the offshore
Yeah,
Asian people are
yeah,
stealing from us.
yeah. Well, it's happening
So
everywhere. Just a totally random thought here. I haven't gone down to Arizona much, but I love, me, I love turquoise. I don't have any of my jewelry
yes,
now, but the Navajo turquoise is amazing. But
yes,
when I was in Gallup, New Mexico, I've only been there twice, but the last time I was there, um, the 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 trader guy said no. I had a nice guy. He was really honest. He said, I'm not supposed to say this, but he said, all of this stuff here, it's all made offshore. He said, if you
yeah,
want if you want anything that's Navajo, you need to go to the Navajo communities. Because he said, as the big businesses here in Gallup and the tourist places, we all buy offshore because there's more money in it for us.
yes,
And I was like,
yes,
oh my God.
yeah,
So
yes.
this is a real thing.
It's a thing, and it's finding the mills. 49 Design out of Calgary. They're Aboriginal owned. I actually went in there. I spoke to some of the people there, and they're Aboriginal owned, and they're pretty careful about who their designers are, etc. Pricey, yes. If you're going to support us, our own people, yeah, you're going to pay a bit more.
Mhm,
If I see Aboriginal designed or Aboriginal looking
mhm.
fabric that's $12, $14, I'm like, okay, where was this made and who by whom?
Yeah,
And the other thing I tell up and coming designers, you're not going to make money on this.
yeah,
You may not even be famous,
yeah,
because that's not what it's about.
yeah,
And like, yes, I am paid well, I should say,
yeah.
but it's not getting rich well, and that's just the
Yeah,
fabric world.
yeah.
Unless you're the mill owner,
I want to
yeah,
tell a story about being married in here. So I discovered I went to an AFN meeting many years ago and saw Dorothy Grant's stuff and some of the other stuff, and I was like, oh my God, I just want this. But I didn't think it was overpriced, but I couldn't afford it. So
yeah,
I came back from the meeting and I said to my mom, do we have a sewing machine? She's like, yeah, why? Because I'm like not the domestic type. She was like, "Why do you want a sewing machine?" I said, "Well, because I want to sew. I want to
Yeah.
make clothes and stuff." So my mom got me set up, and Tina Jack and Mary Lou Jack, they came, some women came and helped me to learn how to sew, and so it turned out I'm good at it. Like I'm pretty good at it. And
Yeah.
I love it. I love it.
Good.
So
Good.
the Klingit designs, not the intricate ones that I've been adopted, and my brother Wayne is a master carver and artist, and his designs, like to do them to do the applique on the sewing machine, like you got to have super lot of skill. I'm like, Wayne, don't make so many detailed corners. I gotta, but anyway, so the designs I draw are not that detailed, but I can do it, and I make beautiful vests, and I line them with cassia, which is
Yes.
it's beautiful. I love cassia.
Yes.
So it's
Yes.
shiny and whatever. So anyway, the Tlingit culture, in my experience of it for 30 years, is that the family matriarchs run things, like, and so I was called to a meeting with Mrs. Nyman and Mrs. Jack, and they were the matriarchs for the Wolf and Crow clans. And I was like, uh-oh. So I went, and they said to me, "We heard you're making designs. We heard you're sewing." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, I am." And "We heard you're selling it." I said, "Yeah, yeah, I am." And she said, "Whose designs are those?" And I said, "Well, they belong to the people tell me what their clan is, and then I make their design. So I guess it's theirs." And she said, "Where are you sitting when you sew?" And I said, I knew I was hooped, eh? I said, "Well, I'm sitting on Tlingit land." "Then they're Tlingit designs," she said. And I was like, "Oh my God." So it's a longer conversation about jurisdiction and ownership and,
Yep.
propriety law around
Yes.
our
Yeah.
designs and stuff, eh? Ultimately, they said to me, "Just don't put the wrong design on the wrong person, because that would
Yes.
be like a huge, big problem." And so
Yeah.
I've never done that, and I
Yeah.
very rarely
Yes.
go anymore for people, unless I really, really feel like I want to, but
Yeah.
I went through a period where I must have sewn and given away 100 garments, jackets, vests. Yeah,
Hmm.
everything. Yeah, I love it. Yeah, but
Yeah.
anyway, my property.
Yeah, no, and that's it exactly, because we've over the years there's been a few cases where famous designers take on and use our designs, and
Mhm,
they're totally stolen,
mhm,
appropriated. Like they're
mhm,
just, it's just disgusting, what I've seen. The only one who's done it right
mm,
at this point is Valentino.
mm,
And he was in direct contact and partnership with Christy Belcourt. I think Christy,
mhm.
anyway, she worked with him,
Mm.
collaboration.
Oh,
Other than that, it's probably been stolen by big, like well-known designers around the world. And same with the fabric.
yeah.
So unless you know, or they say, or you can call the mill, and
Mhm,
like I know with Siltex, they will tell you, yes, Roxanne Shuttleworth and Jackie Travers are who we work with.
mhm,
And so they should be able to tell you who the designers are,
mhm,
and I know if you call Marshall Fabrics in Winnipeg or Edmonton, they will tell you, yes, we work with Carrie, Carrie
mm.
Overbaugh.
Yeah, yeah.
um, Same with International Textiles out of BC, will tell you they work with, I think it's Shannon Ryan Gustafson out
Mm,
of Thunder Bay. So
mm,
they need, if they can tell you who the designer is,
mhm,
then they're legit. If they
mhm,
cannot, and Elizabeth Fabrics, and it's very popular, Elizabeth Fabrics has been around for years.
mm,
And I was those fabrics I started using. They can't, they won't even talk to you. Like they're
mhm,
totally using stolen designs, like
mm,
completely. So, and
mm.
designs from offshore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we went everywhere this morning. We've got about 10 minutes left. I'm looking at my list here from your beginning introduction. You traveled in a band?
Yes. I
Were you
had such interesting
were
little
you like
things. People
playing
will go,
like
people look at me and go, "You raced snowmobiles?" Yes, I was a racer.
Tell me about
I have
traveling with a
I
band.
have the trophies at home. And yes, my mother is a sister, a big sister to the Errol Ranville Seaweed Band.
Ah,
That's where I come from. That's who my people are on my mother's side. So
yeah.
yes, I traveled with the Seaweed Band for 3 years.
Uh-huh.
Um, after his wife died, if you
Mm,
remember, there was a
mm.
horrific accident.
Remember, yeah, I remember.
And yeah, and I sat with him every day for 3 months in the hospital.
Mm,
Um, he was in the hospital, I think, just under 3 months. And yeah, it was an awful, awful time. But so he was recovering. And then we were concerned in the family that he wasn't going to go back on stage.
yeah,
He was so grieving, but he went back on stage. And the way he did it, he mentored young artists, and he
yeah,
still does that.
yeah,
And so he went on stage in support and whatnot, and the people were so kind. Our people are such wonderful people,
yeah,
and they were so kind. And he came off stage and we're both crying
yeah, yeah.
backstage, and but yeah, so and at that point I was working with him,
Mm,
and it was Manitoba Star Attractions is what it was. And then he started gigging, and so
mhm.
I was traveling with him, and he was paying me well. So
Nice. Let me just tell you my seaweed story with I went in my first degree, which is a Bachelor of Education in Business. I waitressed at the stock exchange every Friday and Saturday night to put myself through school because remember I wasn't registered as
right,
Indian and
yes,
I won bursaries and applied for
yeah,
whatever
yeah,
and then I worked. And so when Clint Dudium, who I don't know how old he is
I
now,
love him. He's
when he
died, eh?
oh, did he die? Anyways,
Yes,
let's finish telling you my Clint story.
yeah,
So when he first started fiddling with them, he wasn't old enough to be in the bar. So
no.
so the extent excuse me. He must be making me joke. Okay, I'm not trying to tease too hard, Clint. Anyway, the extension cord used to go right out into the hallway at the
To
stock
the
exchange,
kitchen. Yep.
and he would fiddle in the hallway there.
Yes, yes. I was around. I mean, I was young. He was young as well.
Yeah,
But yeah, no, you're right. He
yeah.
couldn't play.
And we would be
And
here in the bar and like I was a server and we used to wear these horrible hot pants. I can't even believe we did that. Anyway.
yes, Clint and his brother Tommy, I met them when they were like 10.
Mm,
That's how long they've been hanging out with Errol.
when
And
when did he die?
actually, just this spring, he
Oh,
had cancer.
no.
So yeah, it was sad. I was sad.
Oh,
Um, yeah, we've lost a lot of good people
hmm,
recently. But yes, so that's the band I traveled with.
okay.
I was lucky. I was spoiled because Errol has always had roadies.
Hmm,
I was considered a roadie, but I was also actually doing the administration paperwork.
business part.
And but the thing is, if it wasn't drivable, which means like the most we drove was into Saskatchewan,
Mhm.
everything else was done with chartered planes. And
Mm,
so I never had to deal with some of the stuff the earlier roadies dealt with,
yeah,
and I was well looked after. And of course, Errol, he's been sober for how many years too. So and so yeah, it was a great time. I had a lot of fun, and when I was getting tired, I said, Errol, you pay me well, but you can find someone else to do this far cheaper.
yeah,
And he said, but I want you. He said, I trust you, all of that.
yeah.
And so I did take a break, and I did, step back from that. But it was a lot of fun. It was great,
Okay.
you know.
We've got about 4 minutes left each or so. So I like to keep things on time.
Yes.
So tell us about skidoo racing. What the hell?
In the early 70s, all the little communities in my world or in Manitoba, they would host snowmobile races every weekend all winter.
Wow.
And so, my dad was a snowmobile, and we had a club, Lake Riders Snowmobile Club.
Hmm.
And we were the club from Ebb and Flow. And there were local communities like in the area, and we would all support each other. We'd go to Dauphin, we'd go to Eddystone, we'd go like everywhere around us and race. Everybody would go to each other's races and we'd race.
Yeah.
And actually, we were very, very good. Our club, the Lake Riders, we were known. We were winners. We always won. But, people were good sports. Where we stopped racing is it got to be really popular and became worldwide. And Beausejour is the worldwide snowmobile races.
Yeah. I remember
And
going as a
we
child.
went there and we were winning. And then the next winter we went, and of course we all have our Lake Riders crest on our coats and apparel. And we found brake lines cut, like they were attacking us. And
Wow.
so, and my dad just said, we're done. Like this was supposed to be fun. It's not fun anymore. It's dangerous. And so we ended up not returning, like there were people trying to hurt us. They were tampering with our snowmobiles and so things like that were happening.
Probably because you were Indigenous. So anyway,
that and we were good. We were winning. So yes, I raced for about I think 3 or 4 years.
Nice.
But I also so I was on I snowmobiles were part of our life. Like we
Cool.
were on the so that's the snowmobile story. Yes.
So, what would you like to leave the listeners with?
What would I like to leave? Is there anything else on your list?
Oh, well, I did have one more on the Aboriginal livery. What is that?
It's an Aboriginal taxi association. My
Oh,
dad, when he bought the cab taxi business, it was Jimmy's Taxi. And there was one in Cowan and there was one in there was Aboriginal owned taxis all over remotely in Manitoba. And mainly because we serviced First Nations next door, and all of us were Métis communities attached to a First Nation, right? So they had no medical vans like they do today. They had no way of getting to hospital, to doctor, etc. So there was always a taxi business, next door or servicing that community.
Livery, is it livery? Livery?
Yeah, and that's the official name of taxis and cabs.
The new word today.
There you go. Yeah. So he and I think the owner from Cowan and one from OCN started an Aboriginal Livery Association, because the Livery Association at that time was in Winnipeg, which had no idea what they were dealing with and what kind of services, because it's an urban city service versus what my parents and other usually non-status or Métis people cabs livery was dealing with and doing.
Never heard of
so
it.
That's what that
That's so cool.
Yes.
Okay. So I just don't want to leave you without making sure you've said everything you feel like
I
sharing.
believe I have. I've got so much going on and so much I'm living and doing. And what I'll leave you with is I've been a single woman, except for the last year, for over 30 years. And that was by choice. And I've accomplished a lot. I'm a published author. I have I've done a lot. I've designed, I sew, I create, and I walk that red road that with the ancestors. And when I say by choice is because in order to have a relationship and to commit to somebody in a relationship, that takes time. And that takes effort. And so when I say I was single by choice, it was choice. And nobody caught my attention. Nobody was kind of like, okay, and I learned, I posted that, I learned how to go out for dinner alone. I learned how to go to movies alone. So it's a choice we make. And it's okay to make those choices, is what I want to say. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Beautiful.
Yes.
Okay. So when I started the podcast, quite quickly, I realized that Brave Indigenous Conversations is all about the earrings. And so these today I'm wearing are Jennifer Wood's daughter, Shiloh. Many of the people in Indigenous country know who Jennifer Wood is. She's
I
amazing.
do. Yes.
She's
Yes.
amazing. And so this is a pair of little earrings I bought from her daughter Shallow, and I just love them. They're like my kind of everyday earrings in their little pair of moccasins, and they remind me of all the children in our lives and how much we all love our children, and remind me to, to stay focused that what I'm doing is for the kids, eh? It's for the
Yes.
future. Yeah.
The ones coming behind us.
Yeah,
Yes.
for sure. So what I'm going to do now is end the podcast, and then you and I will stay offline and we'll say goodbye.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you for listening.